Hello there. You're listening to 10 Questions, where we discuss the wetplate collodion process and the photographers that create these unique images known as ambrotypes and tintypes. I'm your host, Chad Shryock, wetplate photographer for Pork Pie Photography based in Fort Collins, Colorado. In each episode, I've asked a modern-day practitioner to sit down with me and talk about how they got involved with this vintage process, share some information on their gear and studio, and provide some valuable insights into their creative process. So whether you're just beginning to dabble your toes in the collodion ethers, or you're a seasoned silverbath expert, hang on and see what develops with 10 questions. In this episode, I'm sitting down with a veteran of the process that's been learning, experimenting, and creating images not only in wetplate, but many of the other alternative photographic processes that exist. I know this photographer from an image I first saw in 2015 from a self-portrait that he took back in 2007, but his journey into wetplate goes well beyond a decade before that. Based in Portland, Oregon, I'd like to welcome Jody Ake to 10 Questions.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hey, Jody, I really do appreciate you being on the podcast and sharing what you've been up to lately. We've never met, but I kind of know you as that somber-looking guy on page 451 in my copy of the book of Alternative Photographic Processes.
The Christopher James book.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a great book.
Yep. You are very well studied in the art of photography. You majored in photography at the College of Santa Fe. You've got a master's in photography from the University of Oregon. I see that you also had spent some time working in New York exploring wetplate, and you're currently in Oregon.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So, did you know from an early age that you wanted to be a photographer?
I didn't want to be a photographer to begin with. I was always into the arts, especially like in high school. I was a pretty poor student, except that I really enjoyed the art classes.
Okay.
I originally went to school in Santa Fe, this very, very small liberal arts college called the College of Santa Fe. Unfortunately, it's no longer around. And I went for sculpture.
Interesting.
I took photography classes in high school, and I had a camera, but it wasn't really my thing. I enjoyed it, but I felt like a 3D kind of medium was more what I was interested in. And I didn't really start taking photography seriously till like my sophomore year of college. And it kind of came around in a strange way that like my sophomore year, the first semester of my sophomore year of college, I got into a pretty bad car accident. And I physically couldn't work in sculpture anymore. And so photography was like the only other medium I really enjoyed or had any sort of understanding of.
Nice.
And I thought, like I can carry a camera around.
Well, I'm not sure if it's coincidental or not, but Frederick Scott Archer was a sculptor as well, I believe.
Yes, he was. There's some great photographs of him with these little sculptures that he made, some of the very early photographs of his.
So just to let you know, I mean, whenever I was in the second grade, I wanted to be a semi-truck driver. So, I guess that's, influence of Smokey and the Bandit or something at that time.
I love that movie.
Had you played around with the process before you started working on your thesis?
Well, let's skip forward. I'm in graduate school. It's 1997, and I was looking for something more than just kind of straight photography. My thesis was it goes back. It was kind of based on my own like mortality. Like I had mentioned earlier, I was in this bad car accident, and I never really dealt with everything that went along with it. And so in grad school, I finally started like dealing with what had happened and how my recovery was going, and that turned into like my thesis. And my thesis was a series of self-portraits exploring my own mortality. and it was going pretty decently well, but I just couldn't find a way to express the chaos and the destruction that I was trying to process. Um, I was shooting 4x5 film. I was, making straight silver gelatin. I had experimented with uh, like some platinum and some like Van Dyke and cyanotype, all the normal kind of printing processes you can do,
Okay.
alternative processes now, and none of them just really fit. And I tried to make my own like silver gelatin glass plate negatives. And I thought having that kind of layer of medium between like the image and the camera, like film has a certain look. So I thought like, well, glass plate negative could have a different kind of look, and it could have some distressing that would happen organically. And I couldn't get it to work. And then one day I like stumbled onto an ambrotype, and I was like, I knew what a tintype was, and I knew what a daguerreotype was, and I had seen them, but like I literally was in the university's library in their like special selection, and found a box full of old ambrotypes, and there was a portrait of a man, and it had come out of the case, like classic basic portrait. It was just sitting, in a studio somewhere, and the asphaltum on the back had started to disintegrate.
Okay. Yep.
So it had this great like positive negative, and like the varnish was chipped, and like all this stuff was on the surface of the plate, and I was like this, like that was it. I was like, that's what I'm looking for. That is what I'm missing from my process. And I just kind of dived into doing research on collodion, and I decided like this is what I wanted to try to do.
Nice. You've mentioned that at that time, of course, this is for the most part pre-internet, right? I
Yes.
mean, at that time,
Pre-Google.
pre-Google, yeah, for sure. That there really weren't any online resources other than maybe a Civil War reenactment message board that you kind of got pulled into, right?
Yes, that was it. I tell this story to people when I teach, and like it's not like today. Like there wasn't YouTube, there was not Facebook. The only information on the internet was this Civil War reenactors group that talked about wetplate, and there's maybe 20, 30 active members of that group. So this is 97. Yeah, the information was very, very hard to come by.
So were you able to, I guess, glean enough between the libraries that you had access to plus this message board to figure out how to actually do the process on your own?
I, I I got enough information to do it very poorly. Luckily, the university had a lot of resources for me. I had like my own dark room, and I had my own studio. I had access to larger cameras that I didn't own. The library was a great place to research. I was able to do some like interlibrary loan stuff and find some books that talked about the history of wetplate. I didn't realize at the time, but I had found a book that I own called Keeper of the Light, which is a really old alternative process book, probably from the 70s. And it had a short little chapter about wetplate. So I went from that. I bugged people on the Civil War reenactor group message board for information, but it was hard. It's like I finally got enough resources together to try. And for 4 months, I made horrible, horrible mistakes, just bad. But there was no one to like talk to about,
Right, right.
you know. And the Civil War reenactor groups, like there were a lot of great people on there, like old schoolers, and like old schoolers, not like today old school, like guys who'd been doing it for a really long time, and they really didn't want to give up their secrets because they didn't want you to show up at a Civil War reenacting
Yep.
like event and then like steal their business,
Sure. Yep.
because I had to promise them, I'm like, I'm in art school, like I do not care. I'm not going to show up in a wool suit, and grow a handlebar mustache and like pretend to be a photographer from the 1850s.
Right,
Like I
right.
have no interest in that. And once I convinced them of that, a lot of people shared information and resources with me. But it was just a complete failure almost in everything I did till I met the Ostermans. And they're the ones that really like showed me what I was doing wrong.
Sure. So you got a hold of Mark and Franz Scully Osterman at the the Eastman Museum there in Rochester, I guess, or
They're in the George Eastman House in
Yep.
Rochester. It was fall of '97 is when I found them, and I conversed with them a little bit, and then they of course were like, "Hey, well, we're teaching a workshop." And I think they had taught one already in '97, and they're like, "We're doing another one in '98." And it just so happened to be at the same time as my spring break. So I flew to New York. I spent a couple days in New York, and then went to Rochester and took I think it was I don't know if it was a 1 or a 2 day class. And there were like 8 of us, in the basement of the George Eastman House. And they were able, like, within 5 minutes of walking into the dark room, they were like, I remember there being like, "Oh, well, this is how you pour a plate," and blah blah blah, and they showing everyone, and then it was my turn to pour a plate, and they're like, "Oh, you've got this. You've been doing this for a while," and I'm like, "No, I'm doing it completely different." Like,
yeah.
and they showed me in that first 5 minutes in the dark room 90% of the things I was doing wrong.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it was a just invaluable resource and experience to have for wetplate.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the advantage that people coming into this practice today have with all the information that's available, and especially with all of the online resources that are out there, of being able to see people do this.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine what it would have been like trying to just read a book that talks about, oh, this is how you pour the collodion on the plate, and actually figure out, okay, this is how you're actually supposed to do that based on that limited information.
Yeah, it was hard, and I'm sure you've seen, and most people that have done like some wetplate research have seen like the same illustrations that are probably from the 1860s
Right.
of how to do this, and there are these great drawings of hands, holding a glass plate and how to pour your developer on, but it's nothing like what you really do in the darkroom. They're just great illustrations. So it was really, really hard. And I spent years making failures, trying to figure out how to do the process. And it's nothing like today where there's hundreds of videos on YouTube.
Yeah. I think about, I've probably spent about 6 to 9 months just really trying to study and absorb as much information as I could. And I don't know how many times I watched those videos from the George Eastman Museum. I think it was called like the Photographic Processes series, and it has like a 10 or 12 episodes, and it talks about, Talbot and cyanotypes, and there was one, maybe a 8-minute episode on wetplate that, Mark is in, and I just constantly watched that for a while I was trying to decide, hey, is this something that I really want to get into or not?
All those videos are great. I watched one just recently.
Yeah.
Great resources.
Do you, so your first plate, who did you get signed up, or was it a still life? What were you shooting in?
So I'm like halfway through my graduate thesis, and it was all self-portraits. So my first plates were all self-portraits.
Wow.
Shot in this like storeroom at the University of Oregon that I kind of claimed as my studio. It was just full of junk, broken enlargers and chairs and tables, and I just kind of moved in, and I would work really late at night, so the smell didn't bother anyone. And all my first plates were like all kind of self-portraits, and you would read stuff where it was like it's only sensitive to blue light, so I was like scavenging around for fluorescent bulbs or any kind of lighting I could get, and I would set up a camera and sit in a chair and have like one light on in the room so I could see, and then I would have all these lights plugged into like a surge protector, and I'd lean over with my foot and turn it on and try not to move for like 5 minutes.
Yeah, starting with self-portraiture is really diving right in. I mean, that just adds a whole nother layer of complexity to the process.
It really did, and like self-portraits are never easy. I think, like, I don't teach very much anymore, but I always had my students do a self-portrait. I think it's a great process for any artist to look at themselves and use themselves as a subject. But like, it's hard enough with just a film camera. And you got to remember too, this is like pre-digital. I think the university had one digital camera. So yeah, it was hard, but it was. I mean, that's everything was hard, and that's kind of what I was going for. I wanted to see how the process would work and how it captured people, and I was really kind of hoping and looking for the medium to capture more than just like photographic evidence. I love the history of collodion, where it was like Civil War time era. You'd find these tintypes or ferrotypes or these images of like young men going off to war, and it was like the only image of that person probably ever existed in time.
Right.
And they would stop and get a tintype made and send it home to their like sweetheart, and then they would die in a battle. And I loved like that. That's just the only visual record of this person and their life, and it just seemed like there was so much more to it. I really like the history of collodion too. Like during the Civil War, not like salted collodion you would use on for the process, but like if you were shot on the field, often they would pour collodion over your wound because it would like seal it. And it was mostly ethanol, and ether, so it was also the disinfectant.
Yeah.
So I loved the history of the process being connected to like the bloodiest war of our history and like the medical uses of it, as well as photographically. I was in a really, really dark place, and my work was really, really dark, and it all fit, and I really felt like collodion could see more than what was really there.
Yeah, the history and those same images of folks from the Civil War are what really drew me to the process as well. I had done a little bit of research. I was curious as to how long collodion had actually been around before it started its use as an agent in photography, and it was really from what I could find, it was a pretty short time span. I mean, it was within the year that they started using collodion as that medical adhesive that somebody said, well, hey, let's salt this stuff and let's start using it for photography.
Yeah, I don't think it was around very long before that. And it still blows me away that like photography was ever invented at all. And like the daguerreotype, I've seen it done. I have a daguerreotype of my wife and I still don't understand, how it works. And I'm amazed that any of this ever happened.
Yeah. Jody, you seem to have a wide range of genres that you photograph as far as portraits, landscapes, and still life. Do you find that you're drawn to a particular subject?
I find I get bored with subjects sooner or later. And then I move on to something else. And it's also kind of process too. I don't do a lot of collodion at the moment. I do other processes, but like in the beginning, I was doing all self-portraits, and then after graduate school, I moved to New York. And I was still trying to do self-portraits. I was still just strictly an art photographer. And then one day, someone was like, well, take my picture. And I started realizing that like what I was looking for in the self-portraits, like maybe it wasn't what I was looking for in myself, maybe it wasn't me, maybe it was everyone else. So I started taking photographs of other people, trying to see more of them. And I started doing portraits of just like my friends, the people I met in New York. It's New York, there's like 8 million people there, so you bump into somebody.
Lots of interesting people there, right?
Tons of interesting people, and so I really got into doing portraiture, and I was just doing my own thing, and then it's New York, so everything turns into commerce. So then it was like I got introduced to a booking agent at a modeling agency, so then all of a sudden I had hundreds of young beautiful people that would come to my studio to sit for their portraits, and then I would meet someone interesting on the street or in a bar, and I would start doing their portraiture that way. And it kind of turned into a little, like, that's how I kind of started my career. Like, I was trying to be a photographer, and I was trying to do commercial work, but still be an artist at the same time.
Right.
So I did a whole lot of portraiture, and then I kind of, honestly, I got kind of sick of people. After a while, I was like, I'm not seeing anything new in my portraiture work. And then I was like, well, I'm going to start doing still lives. And at this time too, this was like early 2000s, there was still like a stock photography market out there. And so like I had photographer friends that were making a decent living making stock images. And I'm like, well, I could do that, and so I would find cool objects in New York. Like I found a really cool wrench. I remember the first like real still life I did was a wrench, and it was like curved. And it was just in a box of junk on the side of the road in front of a store, and it was like, $1 a piece. And I bought this really, really cool wrench. And it reminded me of my grandfather who had died in like the early 80s. And he had this great tool shed, and I was too young to appreciate like the value of a tool and to have my grandfather's tool. My brother, older than me, is smarter than me. It took a lot of that stuff, and I wish I had it, but it reminded me of my grandfather. And so like I did a still life kind of the same way I would do a portrait of this wrench. And then I started doing still lifes for a couple of years, and I was trying to sell them as stock images, and then I would get jobs to do like book covers with still lifes. And for me though, as soon as it turns into commerce, it kind of loses its fun.
Okay.
So, and then I'm in New York for a while, and it's like, well, I really, really miss being in Oregon or living in New Mexico, where the landscape's amazing because you're in New York. You always miss what you don't have. And then I started traveling back to the Southwest and back to Oregon to do landscape work, because then I was just really into landscapes for a while. So I find like I don't shoot one subject exclusively. I get bored with a subject, and I move on to something else.
Interesting.
To find something else.
Yeah, that's pretty cool that you're not kind of cornered yourself into a specific subject. So.
Yeah, I like to change things up.
Yeah. What are some of the other photographic processes that you've utilized?
So calotype mostly, kind of the poor man's platinum palladium. I did a series recently in the last few years, and it's all been calotypes. Before that, really, it's been mostly like wetplate and silver gelatin. Calotypes are really cool. I have a really good friend here in town named Ray Bittigen, and he is super great at platinum. His printing skills are amazing, but he's been doing photogravures for the last few years.
Interesting. Okay.
And I am like so hooked on that. He's a great artist, and he's a great friend, and he'll let me come over, and he'll show me how to make a plate, and we'll pull some prints. Like that's where I'm really kind of like, I love that. I'm saving up for a press.
Yes.
Like the dream process would be like autochromes. Like I really tried to do research on autochromes, and I couldn't figure out how to make it work, and no one can really. I did some oratones for a while, like wet plate oratones.
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to mention those. I love the look of those. Just something about them is really interesting to me.
They're amazing, and to see original ones, like Curtis oratones, and there's a photographer, Pillsbury, can't remember his first name. Oratones, they are so cool. And so I did some oratones for a while, but I feel like the process needs to like fit the image. So back in like 1990, I went to Europe with an ex-professor from the University of Oregon, and like it was like we went to London, and then we went to Paris, and we went to all kinds of these little towns in Great Britain, and they did a original performance theatrical piece based on the two writings of Dr. Faustus. And I went along as like the photographer, and I shot all these like 4x5 images of them, like in these like 1,000-year-old cathedrals
Wow.
or in Castle Rising Cemetery where Archer is buried. So I went to try to find Archer's grave, and I couldn't find it.
Ah, okay.
Like it's just great stuff, and like to me, like I was like, oh, those would be great for oratones. So like I made them into oratones, and then I moved on. And yeah, I'm just into processes. Like I would love to figure out how to do Woodbury types. I'd love to do photogravures now. I stumbled onto this guy who will take a gravure plate, and instead of printing on paper, he actually pours a plaster of Paris mold with the ink plate into it, and the ink transfers to the plaster. And so you have a photographic image in plaster. I'm really kind of into that.
That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Have you been up to the Curtis? It's not really a museum, but the gallery there up in Seattle.
I have not. I know it's there. I follow some Curtis people. Years ago, I told my college professor, his name's David Scheinbaum, I saw him at APAD in New York, and I told him I was really trying to figure out how to do oratones, and he talked to the Curtis people to try to get me some information, and they weren't interested. It's sharing how it was done, really. But I haven't been up there, but the museum here in Portland has an original copy of his books.
Nice.
And every once in a while they'll be out on display, and I'll go look at them. They're pretty amazing.
Yeah, cool. So, Jody, tell us a little bit about if you have a current studio or darkroom that you regularly use.
I don't have a dedicated studio now. In the past, I did. In New York, I had a studio that I worked out of, and for a while, when I moved back to Portland, I had a studio to do work, and I just found that I wasn't utilizing it enough. So now, when I do work, I do most of the work out of my basement, and my basement's kind of like a general purpose area, and I'll have to tear down one project to build a dark room to do other things.
Nice. I'm
So
glad I'm not
it-
the only one working in my basement.
Yeah, it's in my basement. I just I'm busy. My wife and I run a few different companies, so my work day is busy, and I do not have the time to dedicate to photography like I used to. And I also I have a side gig called In Camera Industries where I make wet plate holders, and so my basement turns into a production studio where I'm building plate holders for a while.
Nice.
And then I'll be like, well, I want a dark room again. So I'll tear it down for 6 months and build a dark room. And it just kind of goes back and forth between projects. So in the last 5-6 years, I haven't had a dedicated studio.
Okay.
And I wish I could, but it's all time constraints now.
Yep. Let's talk about chemicals. When you first started out, were any of the major supply houses in existence, or were you pretty much on your own with these recipes that you could track down in a book somewhere?
I was on my own. Bostic and Sullivan, was around, and I had lived in Santa Fe, so I obviously knew about them and stuff. But they didn't really have any collodion stuff, and I would have to call Sigma Chemicals, giant chemical suppliers,
Right.
and try to talk to a service rep, and try to convince them, that I wasn't trying to build a bomb. Or I wasn't making drugs to get anything. Ether was the hardest thing to find that they would let a civilian get, and collodion was really hard too. I think I remember paying a fortune for 100 milliliters of collodion from some random chemical place. It was hard, but luckily, also the university had a really great chemical supply kind of house in the university, and being a graduate student, I could go up and be like, I'm looking for this, and they would actually have it and sell it to me.
Nice.
That's basically the cadmium bromides and the iodines, and silver nitrate. But for the ether and the collodion, I had to dig around the internet to find people to buy it from.
Yeah, I take it you weren't trying to buy potassium cyanide at that point.
No, like I kept reading, about like potassium cyanide, and I was like, I could use Fixer instead. I never understood the dangers of working with cyanide. To me, wasn't worth what it did. So yeah, no cyanide.
Yeah. What kind of photographic gear do you typically use when shooting wet plate?
I have a few 8x10 and 11x14 like Century studio cameras. Um, those are my main. If I'm working in a studio, that's what I use. I have a. It just doesn't really have a brand name, but it's like one of those Indian brand folding cameras. And
This
it's
is not
like,
one of those cameras where you shoot and process everything
oh,
inside the camera, right?
no. It's a normal view camera, but it's made in India.
Yeah.
It's a knockoff of an Indian company. I can't remember the name
Yeah.
at the moment. It starts with a V. And it's like an 8.5x15 format, so it's a banquet camera. And I have an 8x10 and a 4x5, 5x7 back for that I made. And if I'm doing landscapes and shooting outside of the studio, I'll use that. And then those are the main cameras, and then I really like Voigtlander lenses, and I shoot mostly Voigtlander large Petzval lenses.
Nice. What about, you mentioned shooting landscapes for wet plate. That brings on a whole nother challenge
Yes.
as far as hauling all of the gear to be able to process the plates remotely. What does your dark box or dark room look like whenever you're traveling like that?
It changes. Most of the landscape work I've done, there's a photographer here in Portland. His name's Mark Rupert. We went to graduate school together, and he was the head of the photography department at the Oregon College of Arts and Crafts. Unfortunately, they closed a few years ago too. But it was a really cool school, and I would go out there and teach. And then after I would teach for like a week, Mark and I would go drive around Oregon shooting landscapes for like a month. And they also had a wood shop there, so I had like their wood department like made me a dark box, and it's just your basic box, on legs, set a nice little folding table. It worked, and that was great if you're on the road for like a month. And then if I'm shooting anytime shorter than that, I'll just use a cardboard box, and it works great. You just put a cloth over the front, and you just put your stuff inside of this giant box, and you dig inside and start working. So it really kind of varies depending on the situation.
Nice.
But it's a lot, and it's also just makes you realize like how hardworking photographers were in the 1800s. Like, we would have a giant truck, and we would pack it completely full with gear and camping stuff. And it'd take like an hour to set up once you get somewhere. And you have to realize that these people in the 1850s, 1860s, 60s were doing this with mules in a wagon.
Yeah.
Like, that stuff's pretty amazing.
Yep. And no rubber gloves.
No rubber gloves. Uh, yeah, can you imagine that?
Oh,
Like, I
gosh.
can't stand the smell of Fixer. And if any photographer that's been in the darkroom can remember getting that Fixer on your hands, and it turns into this sticky, smelly mess, and it never goes away. Oh, horrifying.
What about, I usually ask this question a little bit differently, but I'll say if you had the chance to photograph anyone or anything, what or who would it be?
That's a hard one. Tom Waits,
Okay.
I think. If I had if someone was like dream portrait, Tom Waits probably. Like, I
Okay.
really really love his music. I think he's a visually interesting person. If I had to do a portrait, yeah, I'd shoot Tom Waits.
Okay. Not reached out to him though, right?
No, no. There was some like 6 degree of separation for a while in New York, and I tried. I worked with some people who worked with him, and I was like, hey, do you think you could like ask Tom Waits to answer my email or something? And they were like, no. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay.
I'm not sure. I've seen a few celebrity portraits that have been done in wet plate, but I got to think that those people are used to, hey, you got 5 minutes to get this done and I'm out of here kind of thing. And wet plate is just not made for that, right?
It's not. Like I've photographed a few celebrities. Most of them have been very generous with their time. But yeah, I mean, most like if you think of your normal celebrity, they're busy and they have an entourage, and they don't want to sit still for something that long. I photographed Alan Cummings though, and he was awesome. And
Nice.
it's actually one of my favorite photographs I've ever made is of him. There was this really cool moment in New York where I met a man in a camera store, and we started talking, and he rented a floor in a building just like 4 or 5 blocks south of where my studio was. And it ends up he was renting one of Matthew Brady's original photo studios, and he worked out of it. And
Oh,
so he needed some help with a project he was working on. He needed help like printing these very large photographs on like big Epson printers, and I kind of needed a new place to work out of. So we made a great exchange where I went and printed for him, and then he let me have access to Brady's old studio, and I would photograph people in it.
wow. Now that would be the place to go digging around in the attic for sure.
Yeah, I got in the basement once. It was pretty creepy. I didn't stay. But yeah, it was super cool, and I tried to do this project. We called it like the Brady Project, and I had friends that were much more well connected than I was to people in New York, and they would come in, like they would find people, and I had a friend who was friends without coming, and he came in, and he stayed with me for like 4 hours, and it was literally like me, and I had an assistant, and him in this dark, drafty room in the building where Matthew Brady used to work. And yeah, that was really, really great experience. It went on for about 6 months. And then the landlord decided he wanted to sell the building. So I had to disappear.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
There is a certain level of intimacy and trust that really needs to take place with a subject whenever you're doing this process, right? I mean, it does
Yeah.
take a long time, and it's something that most people don't get to experience. So it's a whole different way of being photographed that they may not know exactly what they're getting into.
Yeah, and there's always that moment. I think we've all done it when we've taken a portrait of someone, and we kind of explain to them what happens and what goes on, and then they follow you into the dark room, and they see that image, that negative image, come up when you develop it, and they're just always like, it's so intriguing, and then when it flips to a positive in the fixer, then they're hooked, and then they're like, normally they're like, well, I'll stay all day. A lot of times they're like, I only have a couple hours, and they see it, and they're like, I'll be here all day if you want.
Yeah.
Like this is so unique, and especially, if it was like early 2000s, I think lots of people have seen a tintype or a contemporary ambrotype now, but back then it was like stepping into history.
Right. Right. Yep. Let's see. Any ideas for a special plate or a series that you would like to do, but maybe haven't had the time or energy to accomplish it yet?
I've been working on and off on a project 5, 6 years now, that hasn't really come together completely. I tried. I probably mentioned earlier, like I don't make a lot of work recently, and it's mostly time constraints. And I have a really bad back. Like I can't really go spend a month on the road taking landscapes again and lugging around, you know, hundreds and hundreds of pounds of equipment. I'm getting too old, and my back is really not in good shape. So it's really hard for me to do that kind of work. So about 7 years ago, 6 years ago, I actually started trying to make my own computer generated 3D landscapes.
Okay.
Because I was like, I
Is
can't
this
get out there.
this is
Like,
using some of the like AI type technology that's in the news
well,
right now?
It's pre-AI technology,
Okay.
but kind of similar concepts. There are some programs that movie studios will use, and they say like, "Oh, we're on Mars," and they'll generate in a computer a landscape that the actors green screen act in front of. And for me, I got to the point where I was frustrated that I couldn't go out. I couldn't go to Shiprock, New Mexico, which I love that place, and I can't
Yep.
get out there. So I'm like, well, why don't I create it in the computer? Because I love technology. And then from there, I can create a positive or a negative and then shoot that and make a plate of it. Of course, when I started this like 6 years ago, the processing power to generate an image like that was quite a bit, and I didn't really have a computer that worked well. The software is really, really complicated, and I don't always absorb it all. So, I've been working on that for a while, and it kind of turned into me generating my own landscapes and then photographing them and turning them into amber types. And then, which is interesting to me because it's kind of this uncanny valley thing. It's like what's real and what isn't, and some people have criticized them and be like, well, they're not really photographs. And I'm like, well, why aren't they photographs? Like, what's a photograph? To me, there's no truth in photography. It's all a lie. So I'm just creating another lie, but it's I created a landscape and there's a mountain and there's some, stuff, there's some trees and then I photograph them and then you can look at them and be like, well, are they real or are they not? And most people don't realize they're not real. They just think they look a little different. And I'm interested in that, what kind of information do you need to have to think that something is real? And is anything really real? And I'm interested in that kind of play. So I've been working on that for a while, and then it turned into video game technology got better. So I have an Xbox, and it works in 4K. So I would literally buy games that I thought were visually interesting, and I would go through the game. And a lot of the games now have a photo mode, where it stops the game, and you can move around a virtual camera within the game and do captures.
Right. Yep.
So I would buy games and I would go in as a photographer. I'd play the game. You have to kill all the zombies before you can take a picture because if you're trying to take a picture, you're getting attacked by zombies. So
Right.
I'd play the game. I've always been into games, and I would photograph these scenes out of video games, and then I would make a digital negative, and then I would make calotypes from them. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. They don't look completely real, but you're holding an actual paper calotype, so you think it's real, and I love that play. And then I showed them at Photolacita a couple of years ago, and then I talked to some lawyers, and they all said I was breaking copyright laws left and right. So I've gotten back to trying to just create my own digital landscapes, but I haven't gotten very far because it's a time constraint.
Yeah, it seems like that's a lot of the same legal discussions that are going on with some of the AI programs today, right? How it's
Yes.
collecting all of this huge database of images and kind of piece parting them together as however it thinks it should go together. But, there's still that creativity that someone had whenever they posted whatever image up on the internet years ago.
Yeah, and I think AI is interesting. I haven't played around with it that much. If there was some way to use it to my advantage in this kind of project, I probably would. Except I do think I'm a little more aware of copyright issues now, and I do think there's some issues now that if you use AI to create something, who actually owns that image. So yeah, I don't know. I'd have to do more research on that.
Yeah. You mentioned calotypes. Have you taken any wet plate images of some of these landscapes? Would you
Yes.
print them out and then set up a camera and actually create a plate from that?
Yeah, that's how they started, and they work. They work really well. I really love collodion, but I also I feel like collodion has caused some health issues for me. Like my lungs are not good. And that's years of being stupid, but like it's also years of like collodion and ether exposure. It's really made my lungs sensitive. So when I shoot in, if I work in collodion, I have to have like major ventilation, or I'll wear like a mask with charcoal filters and stuff to try to protect my lungs.
Sure. Yep.
So it's not like I can just go downstairs and shoot a wet plate. I have to be prepared for it. So I don't do a lot of collodion at the moment, mostly just because of my health.
Right.
And calotypes were just easier health wise, you know, and then it made me realize like how much I really hated standing in a damp dark room, you know, processing prints anymore. Like it really, I didn't enjoy it like I used to. And so once the project was kind of over, I moved on from that,
Okay.
which is kind of leading me towards like photogravure and stuff, for more photomechanical processes that keep me away from like the fixer fumes or ether or cyanide. And it's mostly just health reasons.
Yep. Understandable.
Like collodion, like I don't like a lot of people will work in collodion and then they'll feel kind of crappy afterwards. I don't think a lot of people realize that it can be really, really bad for your health. Prolonged ether exposure is not good for your lungs. So anyone listening, be careful out there.
Be careful. Use your fan in the dark room. For
Yeah,
sure.
lots of fans.
Jody, I'm going to read a quote from Christopher James's book that does mention you. So, today there is an ever-growing community of photographic artists using the wet plate collodion process as their primary means of image translation and expression. Their work is particularly meaningful because it incorporates the traditions and characteristics of the process while addressing the contextual and conceptual trends of contemporary visual expression. Several of the prominent practitioners and innovators in this select group are John Coffer, Eskel Stevens, Joni Sternbach, Franz Scully Osterman, Mark Osterman, Sally Mann, Will Dunaway, Jody Ake, David Emmett Adams, and Ian Rudder. Now, when you hear your name being listed in that grouping, what's going through your mind?
You know, when I read that the first time, I think I probably teared up. Like, seriously, like being just mentioned in the same paragraph as someone like Sally Mann, who was such an influence on me as a young photographer. Like before she started doing collodion, you know, it was just like, yeah, like that's, you know, I don't even know what to say. You're just like, wow, because to me, you know, like I've been doing collodion a long time, and I have a little bit of a name, and you know, I do some shows. I'm in a couple of museums, but I never consider myself to be like a successful artist. You know, like I work a lot and just in solitude, and I just kind of do my thing. And to have someone like Christopher James just even put you in the same categories as those artists, there's nothing more flattering. There's no greater honor than that.
I
Yeah,
mean,
it's
I got to think that you are one of a very few special people that were around at just the right time, that this process so easily could have been lost to history, I think. I mean,
yeah,
there were so few people that were actually practicing this or even knew anything about it. And to be able to pick up the mantle and continue it on and here, 20 years later, there's almost an explosion of collodion photographers that are out there.
yeah.
I think that you got to be somewhat proud of, hey, I was at least able to carry the torch for a little bit longer.
Yeah, totally. There was not a lot of people working in this process in 97, 98. I remember like taking the class from the Ostermans and being like, how many people are doing this? And I think they told me like, maybe 30, and I was just like, it's such an amazing experience to see someone make one and then to make it yourself and just be like, there's only 30 people, like real in the entire world who like really kind of know how this works. And maybe I came up with that number. I don't remember what they told me. It was not a lot of people,
Right.
and I felt, I was young. I was in my 20s. I felt special and entitled, I'm sure, on many levels. But I was like, it felt like I was diving into history and something magical. Like, yeah, I felt like I was unearthing information that was mostly lost to people. And of course, there are people at museums like the Ostermans and who knew and will always know vastly more things than I ever will photographically. But it felt pretty special at the time because I would even talk to like the guy who taught like photo history at the university. Like he didn't really know how it worked. Like historians didn't know or hadn't seen the process, and I was like, oh, I'm able to do this, and people wouldn't believe me. There's this great story where like I went to Paris in 2000 with that performance art group I had mentioned earlier, and on the train from London to Paris, there was a magazine, and it had a little article about like the oldest camera store in current, you know, production for the last whatever 150 years or something, and like this the oldest camera store, and it's in this little area of Paris, and I was like, I want to go there, and me and a friend found it, and I went in and asked them like I'm looking for a brass lens, I'm looking for a Petzl, like I'm looking for something special. And there was this giant lens on the top shelf. And I was like, I want to see that. And they're like, no, you don't want to see that. Here, look at this. Look at this little lens, And I was like, no, 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 no. I'm doing big. I'm shooting 8 by 10, 11 by 14. I need a big lens. Like, show me that giant lens up there. And the guy wouldn't show it to me. And I had to, like, explain to him that like no, I'm not a collector, like I'm an artist and I'm working in wetplate collodion. And he's like, no, you're not. And I'm like, no, I am. Like I'm looking and I'm shooting this stuff, and this guy, it was so weird, it's so cinematic to me in my memory. Like it was like the beautiful French camera store, and there was like a spiral staircase in it, and this older gentleman came walking down the staircase in a beautiful suit, very French man, and he's like, why do you want that? Why do you want to see that lens? And I was like, I'm shooting wet plate. And he goes, tell me how you shoot wet plate. And I explained it to him, and he was like, so you're actually doing this? I was like, yes. And then he was like, Giuseppe, show him the lens.
Really?
He pulls down this, giant Voigtlander Petzl, and I was like, this is it. And I had to explain to them that what I was doing and like step by step how to make a wet plate image before they would show me the lens. Because they just didn't, no one believed me that I was doing it.
Right.
Yeah, it's special. I still have the lens. It's my favorite lens. It's a Voigtlander Petzl. It's like a 14-inch focal length. It's giant. It's huge. I love it. It's great.
Nice.
Um,
Is that where is that where all the good lenses are? They're in France.
They were. It was in France. There's quite a bit in America now, but that was the first giant lens, and it really kind of changed everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, it felt special at that time, like working in the process and digging through archives to find information and experimenting. It's not like today whatsoever.
Yeah. You mentioned Sally Mann. This is a little bit of a tricky question because I'm sure that you and your work are an inspiration to many of the folks that are listening. But who are some of the other photographers that have inspired your work over the years?
Joel Peter Whitkin, Jerry Yulsman, Jan Saldak. I love Curtis. There's a lot of history to him, and like being in the Northwest, a lot, Pacific Northwest, like there's something. It feels like his home.
Yeah.
I really really liked Curtis, but like to me, like as a young art student, like photography to me was never about documentation. Like I never carried a camera around with me everywhere I went. To me, photography was about like fantasy or non-reality. And like Whitkin to me captured this dark, this darkness and this kind of religious iconography. And I've never seen anything like that as a 20-year-old kid. Walking into a gallery for the first time and seeing that work really kind of blew me away. And I thought the same thing with Jerry Yulesman. It's this, pre-Photoshop, how he was able to make these composites. Like, I was always into the non-truth of photography. So those guys really influenced me. Sally Mann, of course, because like, the pictures of her family are amazing. And McGowan, that guy's awesome. Joyce Tennyson, I really, really liked her early work and her like powerful portraits of women. But those are all like, people that I've admired since the 90s or the 80s, and like contemporary photographers, like Chris McCaw, I think is doing some really amazing stuff. My friend Ray that I mentioned earlier, his photographers platinum work is amazing. He inspires me to do more work because this guy just works constantly, and his work's like the opposite of mine. It's all just beautiful. I feel like mine's kind of dirty and ugly at times. Yeah, I mean, there's so much work out there now, and the internet, it allows you to see so much stuff.
Right.
It's hard to even keep track of who's doing what these days.
I have a somewhat funny Curtis story, just because I did not have a photographic education at all. I went to engineering school and kind of happened into this as just something that kind of drew me into it. But I went into a used bookstore here in Fort Collins, and I was just kind of poking around. I was checking out trying to find some photography books, because this was in probably 2015, and I was still kind of in this learning phase about, hey, what is wetplate? For a while I was thinking, well, maybe, daguerreotypes, I'd like to do that. But then I figured out, wow, that is so expensive on a per plate basis.
Oh, I know.
I'm gonna go to wetplate. So I walked in there and I'm looking around, and the woman that was kind of running the shop, she's like, can I help you with anything? And I said, well, I'm looking for any books on photography, And she's like, well, you know what? I've got this book over here, and it's about this guy named Edward Curtis. It's called Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher. You should check this out. So I ended up buying that book, and that's how I was exposed to Curtis, was just by some happenstance event at a used bookstore, and just fell in love with his work. I mean, just amazing, reading about his history and life story as to how much effort he put into doing what he was doing there was really amazing.
Yeah, I was exposed to his work like in college, like the photo history stuff. And also living in New Mexico, there's a large native population, and we'd see a lot of work like that in town. And I didn't appreciate it much till I got older and started learning more about his history and how connected he is to the Northwest. And being here in the Northwest, it's like, you can feel it. And yeah, no, it's pretty amazing, a story to his. And like, I don't know, I'm like, his oratones to me they're just absolutely beautiful. If you see them in person, they're amazing. And every once in a while, like, he pops up in my world. It was like, I was going through like my Facebook memories the other day, and like, I remember one day I was like walking home, and I was like thinking about photography and being like frustrated that I don't have the time to do more photography. And in front of my house on the sidewalk was a postcard of Curtis, and it was an image of I can't remember the name of it, but it was like, it was a chief in the full headdress, like on a horse, and the horse was like drinking from a stream, and it just was laying in front of my house. And I was like, God, that's just like the photo God's telling me like to get to work. Like I'm like, oh, I don't have time to do this. My back hurts, and blah blah blah. And I gotta get back to work, and then like there it was, like just get back to work.
Just that serendipitous event that happens, and it's like, wow.
Yeah, I love those. I love those. I love it when it happens. The chaos comes together to show you something,
Yeah.
and I love those moments.
Jody, I've seen you as someone that helps out with a lot of troubleshooting on many of the online groups, and I, appreciate that someone of your experience is out there still trying to help educate people and work through issues that they have. What motivates you to keep giving back to the new people that are just coming into the practice?
Um,
Because it
I
sounds like that was not your experience, right? I mean, you
no,
dealt with a lot of people that were keeping the
the
secret.
yeah, the Civil War community did not want to give up the secrets, and I really had to convince them that I wasn't after their job before they would help me. But once, I met some amazing people back then. I don't want to say like all Civil War reenactors are jerks, but like,
Yeah.
I some people really, really helped me out. Old school people that have been doing this a lot longer than me. But like, Facebook is a good time waster, and it's also a great resource. And I'll see somebody ask a question, and then a lot of times I'll see people answer it, and for what I believe is not the correct way. And then bad information is worse than no information. And
Yeah.
so, sometimes I do feel like, oh, I've been doing this for 25 years. Let me tell you how I do it. And it feels good to help people, especially when they're genuine and they're like excited and they're having a simple problem that there's a simple answer, but that might not be simple to them. Um, so yeah, I mean, I try to help when I can, and I try not to get into like Facebook arguments that happen a lot, um, and internet arguments. So like, yeah, I just try to help. I feel like Collodion's a special community, even though it's what 10,000 people now. Probably, there's a lot of work going on, and I try to help when I can, and I kind of feel like an educator at times, and I'm really not a good teacher, so like I don't teach really much anymore, but like I feel like I need to help because so many people helped me.
Yeah, that's great. Have you ever thought about how your experience would have been different if you were to start in collodion today with all the information that's kind of freely available?
I probably wouldn't have done it. Like, I loved the R&D of it back then. Like I really was like, what if I had an extra gram of potassium nitrate? Like what's going to happen? I loved figuring out my own way, and I loved that like it was kind of an almost dead process. Today, I probably wouldn't have done it, honestly.
The challenge just wouldn't be there, right?
Yeah, I don't do anything easy. Right? I don't know. I look back. I don't like. I own a digital camera. I don't use it. I use it for work. A digital workflow is boring. Like inkjet prints are boring to me. I can't make them look as good as I want, and like it. Yeah, I've always do things the hard way because on some level it just makes it feel better. And like collodion is so fickle. It's demanding. And when I was really working at collodion, like shooting every day, like there's like 5 6 years in New York. That's all I did. Like I just photographed. You At least I did, and I think some people romanticize the process. Like I had a connection with my bottle of collodion and my silver nitrate. Like I had to like work with it to get what I wanted. And sometimes there'd be those nights where it's like it's 1 in the morning and I've been shooting for 5 hours and I can't get what I want, and you have to like make a deal with the spirit of collodion to like just let me get this done. before I get too high from the ether or too
Right.
tired, like, you force it or beg it to work for you. And to me, those moments are when the best things happen. Like, if today, if I could just be like, why can't I get this to work and like get on YouTube and figure it out, I probably just wouldn't be that interested.
Yeah. That's great. So, Jody, what's the best way for folks to see your work and maybe mention some of the museums or other collections that have your works on display?
My personal website's jodyake.com. That's JODYAKE. I have like that side business where I build like camera stuff, and that's wetplateholders.com. I don't have any shows at the moment. I do have work here at the Portland Museum. I do have work at the Museum of Contemporary Photography. Just acquired some stuff. That's at Columbia College. I was just in this traveling show for it was up for like 5 years, called the Dandelion Project, and it was about African American fashion culture, and it was a giant show, and I had like 4 or 5 plates in that, and that traveled around a lot, and it just ended middle of last year. I'm in the Sid collection in Brazil, if that's still around. I don't think it's around anymore. Dancing Bear collection, that is William Hunt. He's a big collector in New York. He shows a lot of work around the country. I'm in his collection. Sometimes I pop up in a show. And that's kind of public collections. That's probably about it.
Nice. I've seen some of those dandelion images. Pretty unique perspective there on
That
fashion.
was super fun. I mean, that was a New York thing, like I had mentioned earlier. Like, once it turns like commerce, it gets kind of weird. But was hired by a magazine to do a fashion shoot, kind of based on James Fantasy's photographs, and it was the first time I ever really worked with like an art director, and there were like 15 models and hair and makeup and the whole thing, and that was pretty amazing. I really do love that project. Some really beautiful fashion-oriented stuff, but done in a classical, 1800s kind of perspective.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, Jody, I want to thank you not only for sitting in and talking to me today, but also for just being that inspiration and motivator to folks that are somewhat new or have gotten into the process over the last decade, and being able to reach out to you for support, and being able to see some of the unique images that you've created over your artistic career. So thank you again.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Jody. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode and maybe even picked up some insights that will help you along in your own wet plate journey. I'd love to hear from you on who you'd like to have on in a future episode. So send me a message and follow our Instagram account at 10 questions with any feedback. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast provider. Thanks for listening to me, Chad Shryock, and my expert guests, and I look forward to you joining me again in the coming weeks for a new episode of 10 Questions.